Alright guys, new video today. I'm super excited for this one. This is actually a structure deck tier list. I'm going to look over every single structure deck that's ever come out, and I'm going to review them based on a multiple of categories. Number one, creativity. It's probably going to be the most important. Basically, creativity within the deck. Number two, value. Value basically means the whole point of a structure deck is you buy three of them. If you can buy three structure decks, you can have somewhat of a competitive viable build or a competitive viable deck. Basically, yeah, value is basically can you buy three and be able to win games. That's that part of that. And then the last part is just competitive or meta impact during the time of release, or if it happens to be the case, the competitive impact immediately or right now. But that is basically it. So we're going to do that quick tier list right now. If you like this video, leave a like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. And if you have any other ideas for tier list or ranking videos, just let me know. And of course, check out any of the other ones on my channel. But let's get started. First up, we've got, and these are the early tier list. These are the early decks right here that I'm going to show you. These are all, they all got released around 2005, 2006. The early structure decks have one big, like major issue, and that is the fact that they're more of reprints than they are competitive structure decks. And that's going to be the issue with the majority of these front ones here. But we're going to start off with the Red Eye structure deck. I forget the exact name. No, I'm sorry. It's Dragon's Roar. This deck is decent. At the time, dragons were really a very underwhelming type. And on top of that, especially Red Eyes. The Red Eyes was just very bad compared to, like, even compared to Blue Eyes, which was also at this time a very bad card. I'm honestly going to put this somewhere around D tier. It's not F tier. It's not like absolutely terrible. This deck had very small meta impact. Virtually nothing was really all that great. The reprints in the deck were actually better than the entire deck. The boss monster can't be special summoned unless you tribute a Red Eyes. And at the time of release of this set, the only way to really summon a Red Eyes was to tribute a Red Eyes Black Chick. So summoning the boss monster of this deck was basically like a 3-card combo. You needed Red Eyes Black Chick in hand, Red Eyes, and then you got to summon this thing, and then your opponent activates like compulsory evacuation device, and then you just lose everything. You just poured into all of that. So this deck was just on release, honestly not that good. It was not really competitive at all, and as far as creativity speaks, it put a pretty cool boss monster on the field, the Red Eyes Darkness Dragon, which is basically it gains 300 attack for every dragon in the graveyard, which the whole concept of the deck was to fill up your graveyard with dragons. Over the course of a few turns, tribute a Red Eye, summon this thing, and then attack for game. But it's such an inconsistent strategy. Really not that great of a deck, to be honest with you. And like I said, these first ones were really kind of, they were kind of lackluster. The reprints were better than the actual cards. Yeah. Next, we've got the Zombie Horde structure deck. This one is better. I'd put this somewhere in C tier. Again, this one is just all complete, more of a viable deck, just because Pyramid Turtle was just such a good card. And then you had just a few pretty good reprints like the Vampire Lord and the 2400 attack. I forget his name, but he's a 2400 attack zombie that can basically attack over any warrior, so it helped you get over BLS and stuff like that. The boss monster of this deck was really not that great. The boss monster basically allowed you to to banish a Vampire Lord to summon it, that's the only summoning requirement. You have to banish a zombie what's his name, a Vampire Lord to summon him, and then you can discard a zombie to special summon a zombie from the graveyard with less attack than the zombie that you sent to the graveyard, which that effect was just extraordinarily lackluster, especially since this card was, again, so difficult to summon. And like the second you summon this card, your opponent could just torrential tribute you, and then you lose everything. It's really not that good. Next, we've got another deck. This is the Fire deck. I forget the exact name, but this is another kind of D tier deck. I know it seems like the decks are really bad, but these early decks were really just underwhelming in terms of what they can do. They typically came with one boss monster. Yeah, it wasn't doing a whole lot. But this one is actually, again, a pretty not that great of a deck. Basically, the whole deck focuses on inflicting life points, and not a lot of decks actually have the courage to do it, because the whole thing with it, inflicting life points is really a balancing act. You have to inflict life points, you have to be able to inflict enough where it matters, but you can't inflict too much where you can FTK your opponent. So that's kind of the issue with, just from a deck building standpoint, or like from a game design standpoint, in terms of like direct life point infliction cards. You can't make them too good, because then people would just win on turn one, and that's why this deck just kind of falls flat. In addition to that, the boss monster is like really bad. It can't be special summoned, and then when you actually do manage to summon it by tribute summoning, and this is a 2 tribute monster that's like 2700 attack, so it's really not all that great. You can banish up to 5 fire monsters from the graveyard, and then destroy that many spawn trap cards on the field, which is like, just, that just has nothing to do with the deck whatsoever. Like, the whole deck is about inflicting life points, and then the boss monster like pops back row and can't be special summoned. Like, it's such a, it's so like out there. But some of the reprints, like I said, all of these decks had very, very good reprints for their time. There were a lot of cards during this period that were very, very difficult to get, and obviously these decks made them like 50-cent cards. Stuff like Pot of Greed became very, very cheap. Solar Flare Dragon, just various cards like that became very, very cheap. But this was an underwhelming deck. This deck is actually pretty good. This is the water deck. This came out alongside the fire deck. This is a tough one, because this didn't have like a huge amount of impact, but it was actually very much creative, and it was very much usable within the it was very much usable if you bought through. I'm actually going to put this in A tier. This is, out of the old decks, by far the best one. Yeah, like, it had the most going for it. So this deck, it made a huge it made a huge impact in terms of creativity. Like, this was a very creative deck. This is the first deck in Yu-Gi-Oh where the field spell actually mattered. Like, in other decks, in other aspects of Yu-Gi-Oh, whenever you had a field spell, it was basically it just gave you an attack boost, but it didn't actually do anything. It didn't advance play, it didn't help your strategy out, it didn't make it easier to summon monsters or more difficult. It just increased attack by, 200, 300, 400, whatever it might be. But this deck actually, it made it so the field spell actually mattered. A lot of the cards worked around the field spell, like the boss monster, the Daedalus, worked around the field spell. You got to, obviously the attack boost, but that didn't matter. But the main thing is that all water monsters lost 1 level, so it made it a lot easier to summon water monsters from your hand, from your graveyard. And also, it worked very well with like Gravity Bind, because you could summon like level 4 water monsters, activate Gravity Bind. Now they're level 3. You can attack and your opponent can't. On top of that, it can make level 5 water monsters level 4. So now you can normal summon level 5 monsters without tributing. You can summon level 7 monsters by tributing 1 monster. And all of the like the boss monsters, the Sea Dragon, the Levier Sea Dragon, was also very good, just because you can summon it off of 1 tribute and then blow up the entire board. And then the boss monster of the deck is a little less good than the old the old Leviathan, the old Sea Dragon, just because you needed to tribute the old Sea Dragon to summon the new one, which was kind of lackluster, but it did send cards from the hand and field other than itself. So it has a pretty cool like board nuke. But by far, this is, of all of the old structure decks, like all of the original like first release structure decks, this is by far the best one. Definitely deserves to be A tier. Very creative, changed the game significantly, because it really took field spells to the next level. Next, we've got another structure deck I don't think is very good. This is the Warrior Command, Warrior Triumph. I'm actually going to put this here. I might even move it down as the list progresses. I really don't like this deck. It's basically, actually, during the time of release, this deck was pretty much like, I don't know. I'll put this in F tier. I really don't like this deck. So this deck is just a real like dumb thing all around. So it's built around Gearfried. Gearfried is a card that cannot, basically when it has a card equipped to it, the equipped card is destroyed. So they built an equipped deck around a monster that can't be equipped to, which was already just very, very dumb. But on top of that, the boss monster is, again, it can't be special summoned. When you do normal summon it, it equips a bunch of equip spells from the graveyard to itself, which is a cool effect. But this is a 2 tribute monster. Like, it was so lackluster. The only thing that was good about this deck is that it reprinted the entire warrior toolbox in a nice, easy, and cheap way. And warrior decks during '05 were like during the 2005 GOAT format, which is when this deck came out in that general time period, were very good. So like the reprints in this deck are pretty good, but the deck itself, like the actual strategy, the boss monster, all of that stuff was just super lackluster. Yeah, really not good. Next, this is slightly better. This is the Dark Magician deck, the old Dark Magician deck, slightly better than the old Red Eyes deck. The boss monster was easier to summon. Dark Magician was easier to summon, and by consequence, the old boss monster is easier to summon. Basically, all they did is just reprint all of the Dark Magician cards and Magician's Force with a few other spellcasters. And then on top of that, they came out with Dark Eradicator Warlock, and he basically, all he does is when either player activates a spell, you inflict 1,000 life points to your opponent. No protection, no advancement of play, no nothing. It basically just gave you a boss monster that was just okay, and you needed to tribute a Dark Magician to summon it, which, again, it's not like today where you have a ton of different ways to summon Dark Magician. It was actually fairly difficult to summon Dark Magician, so you gave it up just to get a monster that was not even that much better than Dark Magician. It was really not worth it. It didn't have, like I said, a very big meta impact at the time. Next, we've got this is like a Rock Fortress deck. I'm going to put this at the bottom of... I'll put this right here. This is another deck that just... Actually, no, this had... Well, I don't know who I'm lying to. This is an F tier deck. It had, like, almost no meta impact at all. Like, whatsoever. Like, this deck had so many... It went in so many different directions in terms of its design. It's built around the Sphinx monsters. And it basically is all about summoning rock monsters in defense mode, having your opponent attack into them, or flip summoning your rocks in order to do a variety of different effects. It's basically actually no, I like the creativity of this deck. I'll say I don't think that was a fair grade. From a creativity standpoint, I think this is actually more creative than all of these decks here by a landslide, because it actually was like their first attempt at a creative deck. Now, I don't think that the deck actually succeeded competitively or in terms of value. I don't think it succeeded, but in terms of creativity, I got to give it to them. This was a pretty cool deck, just because the whole concept of the deck was it was all about defense. It wasn't about offense, just about defense. The boss monster was 4,000 defense, and it inflicted life points every single time one of your monsters was flip summoned. You summoned it just basically by tributing a Sphinx monster, which was, again, pretty cool. And then some of the Sphinxes were pretty good, like Guardian Sphinx, because if you flip summon Guardian Sphinx, you get to basically return all of your opponent's monsters back to their hand, non-targeting. Very, very good effect. And then, of course, all of those monsters flip themselves back face down. Like, there were good parts of the deck, but for the most part, the deck was actually extraordinarily lackluster. And, yeah, that's my main, like, gripe with the deck, is that it's just very... It's a little bit too slow and defensive of a deck, and I know that was their initial, that was their whole point, but there were too many cards that were out at this time that just completely wrecked this deck, and today it's just completely, totally unplayable. This is the Samorig Deck. Honestly, like, this is another, like, bad deck too. You got one new boss monster. I think this is actually worse than the Fire Deck. Actually, I think this might be one of the worst decks. Basically, the whole point of this deck was to summon this Samorig monster. End phase, you inflict 1,000 life points to both players, and then you inflict less for every spawn trap card you or your opponent controls. So it'll inflict 1,000, but if like one of you has like one spawn trap card set, it basically inflicts 500 less. Like, it was just like the boss monster's terrible. Winged Beasts at this time were just totally unprepared for anything. Like, it basically reprinted a bunch of Winged Beasts, gave them a bad boss monster. Like, it was just not... This is not a good deck at all. As a matter of fact, I think this is so far the worst deck we've read. This is the Ancient Gear Structure deck. This reprinted the gadgets, and the gadgets were actually pretty good. But the Ancient Gear cards in the deck were actually pretty terrible. So I don't even know where to... So the gadgets are good, and the gadgets were in there. And then the boss monster was not so great. This is a tough one. I'll put it right here. Just because it's not particularly creative, but it is cool that they mixed gadgets and Ancient Gears as an archetype together. And also the gadgets were actually pretty good, because they always gained you advantage. You summon it, you search another gadget. So that part of the gadgets was pretty cool. The Ancient Gear part, I gotta say, was pretty much unusable. Like, the Ancient Gear monsters at the time were not all that great. But I'd say this is an okay deck. This deck is pretty cool. This is the Dragon Lord deck. This deck I'd comfortably put right here. This is probably C tier. So this deck basically focused 100% about summoning dragons from the graveyard. And just generally summoning big monsters from the graveyard. And it really took Yu-Gi-Oh! To the next level in terms of turning the graveyard into basically a second deck. It had a lot of very good cards, even though the boss monster was honestly very underwhelming, just because it basically just you can't special summon it unless you special summoned it from the graveyard, and the only way you could summon it from the graveyard if it was sent there from the field. So you'd have to actually fairly summon it and then summon it back. So the boss monster was just like terrible, and then all it did was just gain attack for a monster in the graveyard, like in terms of for the level of a monster in the graveyard. Very underwhelming boss monster, but the concept behind the deck was actually very, very ahead of its time in terms of turning the graveyard into something more important. The Dinosaur Deck, this is another deck that's just not good. This is another F tier deck. This is the first Dinosaur deck, so be very mindful of that. They came out with Superconductor Tyranno. Again, not a great card. He was a 3,300 monster. That was only 2 tributes, and that was one of the biggest for its time. Then its effect was you tribute a monster, inflict 1,000, but then you can't attack, which is and it's once per turn. I have no idea why the boss monster of a dinosaur deck has a cannon soldier effect on it. That just didn't make sense to me. And dinosaurs at this time were just very, very they weren't that great. Alright, so next we've got the Dark Emperor structure deck. This structure deck was actually very good. This was during this came out in 2008. Huge resurgence in terms of dark decks. 2008 was right around when Dark Armed Dragon came out, so dark decks were absolutely disgusting. You were seeing a lot of synchro cards come out, tuners like Krebons, stuff like that. So this deck actually was a huge part of if you were building a Teledad deck, this deck was actually a huge part of that. It came with the Sangan, it came with a lot of the stuff that you needed. And this is, like I said, this is a huge resurgence in terms of dark decks. So this deck was actually very, very good for its time. In terms of the cards that it actually released, its boss monster, I got to tell you, out of its boss, it has a better boss monster than all of these other decks. Literally every single one of them. This was the best boss monster out of all of them. I'd say this deck is a pretty solid A tier. It saw a lot of competitive success. The boss monster basically, basically it's a monarch. You tribute summon him, and then you get to pop a card. And if you pop a dark monster, you get to inflict 1,000 life points. That inflicting 1,000 life points isn't that important, but you get to pop a card on summon, which is pretty good. And it was very easy to accumulate damage. It was very easy to accumulate advantage with all of the dark monsters. And like I said, this was actually a fairly good deck just to pick up. You could pick up 3 of them and have a fairly competitive, fairly viable deck. Unlike the rest of all of these, it'd be very difficult to actually be competitive with 3 of them at that time. Next, we've got the Zombie World deck. This is the first Zombie World deck, so let's make that very clear. This is not the second Zombie World deck. This one actually is... In terms of creativity, this is actually a pretty cool deck, but in terms of actual use, it was actually not that great. Simply because the cards were just not... It just wasn't a fast enough deck at the time. The best card is basically a boss monster, which is the Red Eyes Zombie Dragon. You basically activate Zombie World, turn both graveyard zombies, turn both field zombies, and then you can basically destroy any monster your opponent controls with the Red Eyes, and then summon it back and accumulate advantage like that. It was a very cool concept, I gotta say, because it basically turns everything into all monsters on the fields and graveyards into zombies, and then it basically allowed you to special summon zombies from your opponent's graveyard. Same thing with Zombie Master, other cards like that. Some really good zombie reprints in there. I'd say this is like at the top of C tier in terms of creativity. Creativity is basically what's carrying this deck. Competitively, it wasn't all that great the first time around, but this deck would later get a remake, and we'll talk about that. Next, we've got, this is again a deck that I think creativity-wise, I'll put it right here. Creativity-wise, this deck is actually pretty good. This is the Spellcaster Command structure deck, I think. But basically, this basically is a deck that revolved all around spell counters. Its boss monster was okay. You had to take off 6 spell counters off the City of Endymion, and then you get to special summon it and search any spell card. So that effect was actually pretty cool. It wasn't particularly easy to get spell counters onto the City of Endymion at this time. But the City of Endymion was pretty cool because it... the Citadel of Endymion was pretty cool because it basically was like a storage device for all of your... what's it called? Spell counters. And I respect the fact that Konami tried to make spell counters better, because spell counters came out in Magician's Force, and they were really not that great. And then they just kind of waited for a really long time and finally tried to fix what they had created. Although I don't think it actually succeeded competitively. It was a pretty creative concept. Next, we've got the Warrior Strike structure deck. This deck I don't like at all. It's sad because I bought a lot of these structure decks on release, but this is one of the ones I bought on release too. Very underwhelming deck. I actually think it's even worse than the other one here. This deck basically focuses around 2 things: warrior monsters and Gemini monsters. I really do not like Gemini monsters from a design standpoint. I don't like them at all from a design standpoint. I think they're way too slow. There's no cohesion between them, and I could probably count on one hand how many good Gemini monsters there have ever been. So from that standpoint, I really don't like this deck. I think Geminis are just... I just never thought that they were a very good concept. I think that, what are the good Geminis? Ill Blood was a good Gemini. Back in 2007, Ill Blood was a good one. And then there's the Gigaplant. And then there's the Fusion monster that makes all Geminis effect monsters, in which case it just makes your nerf deck into a regular deck. I mean, I really don't like Geminis as a concept, and especially since most Geminis, even if you Gemini summon them, have such an underwhelming effect. Their effect will be like, okay, this card becomes a tuner, or you can special summon a monster from the graveyard, or it's like, this card gains 400 attack. All of the Gemini effects are always so underwhelming, and even when they do have a good effect, you have to wait a whole turn just to basically use them anyway, because you have to normal summon them, and you have to normal summon them again. So it's really, from that standpoint, they're just very, very underwhelming. The boss monster, again, you summon it, and then you have to normal summon it again. And the problem with that is its effects are just not even that great. It basically has a negate of a spell and trap card by popping an equip spell, which you've already burned all these resources into summoning him, so how many equip spells are you really going to have? And then, yeah, it's just, I'm not a fan of the deck, I gotta say. I'm not a fan of the deck, and I'm not a fan of Geminis as a concept. Next, we've got a pretty good deck. This was actually pretty competitively viable. I'll put this is a solid one. I'll put this in A tier because this was actually a competitively viable deck that came out. And right off the bat, you could buy 3 of this and you had a pretty good deck. The boss monster is really the shining force of the deck. He special summoned himself pretty easily. He had a targeting effect that was pretty good. When he got destroyed, you get to pop a card. If he gets targeted, you get to discard a card from your opponent. He was actually really good, and he really carried the deck. And you could buy 3 of this deck and win quite well. Next, we've got the Monarch structure deck. I think this is going to be our top of C tier. Monarch deck, actually, this is a very odd deck, because most structure decks are not built around a character. Most structure decks are built around a theme, and this was actually built around a character, which made it a little bit weird because you got a bunch of random cards. But the main thing that you actually got in the deck were the Gravekeepers, and the Gravekeepers are very, very good, as an archetype, because it shuts out a lot of graveyard decks. And during the time, a lot of decks were becoming more and more graveyard reliant. And because of that, this deck just Gravekeepers in general. It reprinted all of the Gravekeepers. It really didn't come out with much new, and then it gave you Lava Golem. So like it was a pretty good deck to pick. Like you pick up 3 of these and you have a pretty solid deck. I gotta say that. And from that standpoint, this is very good in terms of creativity. Gravekeepers are a pretty creative deck. It's like a deck that revolves around a floodgate. In terms of competitive viability, this deck was like, you know, you took this to a tournament, you could definitely win here and there. Like you're not gonna get blown out by this deck like you would with a lot of these other decks. This was actually a pretty decent deck. And then Lava Golem is always like a pretty good way to get rid of other people's boss monsters. So yeah, definitely it's somewhere here. This is Dragoonity Structure Deck. This is a pretty good one too. I'd say this is a pretty solid B tier. Not like a huge amount of impact when it came out, but it was very, very good. It was a very fun deck to play, and this is one of the first decks where they came out with multiple. What is it called? When they came out with multiple new cards in the deck. Like a lot of these other decks, either came out with like one new card, or in the case of Merrick, they came out with no new cards. But this is one of the first decks that actually came out with multiple new cards, and it wasn't just like one new card. You actually got to, you know, try out a variety of different new things, which I liked about that. Next is the Master Hyperion deck. This is definitely A tier, top of A tier, if not S tier. This deck, if I remember correctly, actually won Worlds. This is a very good deck. So they came out with the agents were basically the agents were an archetype that came out in Ancient Sanctuary, which was a Yu-Gi-Oh set, and they were just like absolutely terrible. Nobody ever used them. They were just completely just underwhelming. There wasn't any real good ones except for Venus. And then all of these years went by, and people just were like, yeah, you know that ancient, you know those agents that came out. First of all, you guys never finished the planets, but outside of that, that was a pretty cool concept. So they picked it up and they decided to actually finish all of the planets and give the deck support. They came out with a card called Earth, the Agent Earth, which searches, and then if you have Sanctuary in the Sky, you get to add an additional. You get to add a base, not an additional card, but a Hyperion. And then the boss monster was also very good. This is the first time where boss monsters were actually like. This is the first time, other than the Yugioh deck, where the boss monster was actually very good. Like all of these boss monsters were actually very much a pain to summon, and on top of being a total pain to summon, when you did finally summon them, their effects were like just lackluster. But Master Hyperion was actually a very good card because you summon it by banishing an agent, and then from your hand, field, or graveyard, super easy. And then on top of that, it has an effect where you can banish a Light Fairy and then pop a card. If you have Sanctuary in the Sky, you can actually pop. You can use that effect twice, so you can pop 2 cards. That was very good for that time period. That was actually a very good effect. Especially since you can swarm the field very easily with light monsters with Venus, because you could just summon a bunch of Mystic Shine Balls. So you could just summon a Venus, summon 3 Shine Balls, banish the Venus, and to summon Master Hyperion, and then get rid of the Mystic Shine Balls out of your graveyard and pop 2 cards. It was very easy to do. Yeah, the deck was very consistent, very good. Definitely A tier. Did, you know, very well competitively, and definitely was very much worth the value that you pay for it. And if I remember correctly, it actually came with Solemn Judgment too, like as a common. Very good deck. Next, this is definitely an A tier for me. It hits all of the notes. It might even be S tier. Like this deck is very good. This is another deck that I could even put this in S tier. This or the Master Hyperion deck. In terms of, actually, and I'll put it in A tier just because the only thing this is missing is like raw value in terms of like you buy 3 of these and you have everything you need. You definitely have to add cards to this. You can't just play with the 3 structure decks. Same thing with this. You can't really play with the raw structure decks. It's tough to even say. You can even put this above the Dark World. But Dark World is very good because it's a very creative deck. It's all about discarding your cards, and then you get all of these additional effects. The only thing that sucks about Dark Worlds is they miss timing. So if a card discards for cost, like trade-in, for example, you don't get their effects. But outside of that, this deck was very, very good. This is another one that did very well competitively. This was, of course, a very much slower game at that time, so you can afford to play slower discarding cards and stuff like that and go a little bit more into the grind game. But to this day, Grapha is really good, and so is Snow. Like, Snow is very, very good. And then we've had some more Dark World cards that have come out over the years, and even I think in the previous set, I think in Phantom Rage there was actually a new Dark World card that was actually pretty good. It was like a monster reborn for the archetype. But yeah, to this this deck was very very good. A lot of very competitively viable. Very um, had a huge amount of impact, and on top of that, great value and very creative deck. I like the deck very very much. This is a very good deck. This is another one that this is the Dragons Collide. All three of these decks are actually very like this is now we're getting into. We went through a lot of junk decks, but now we're getting into the really good decks. This is another deck that I remember picking up 3 of these and picking up just tour guide, just literally just like battle pack tour guide, and that alone was like a totally competitive deck. You basically spend $30. You pick up a copy of Five-Headed Dragon. You have a copy of Five-Headed Dragon. You have 3 copies of the what is it called? Future Fusion. Use 3 Future Fusions, Five-Headed Dragon, and then you pick up tour guides, and you basically had a competitive deck. This deck was like absolutely insane in terms of value. Both of the dragons were very very good in this deck. The Light Pulsar, Dark Pulsar. Light Pulsar being better than Dark Pulsar, but still very easy to summon. This is like the first return of the Chaos Dragons, or in Chaos Monsters in general, because for a long time BLS, Chaos Emperor Dragon, and even for a small bit of time Chaos Sorcerer were all banned and basically were unusable, but this basically returned all of the Chaos Monsters, and it was a very good deck. On top of that, you had the Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon, which was also an insane card, and after this deck took off, that actually got semi-limited and then eventually limited. Future Fusion eventually got banned, but quite a few different things happened. This deck had a lot of concepts. This is a very competitively viable deck. You got a lot of value out of it. As a matter of fact, just in terms of raw value, I think I don't want to put it into S tier, but I'll put it at the top of. I can't put it at the top of A tier because technically this one world. So, yeah, I think it's actually pretty comfortable up there where it is. But again, you can easily like move this up to S tier. This is a very very good deck on release. Tons of insane strategies. This is at the top of B tier. This is the Six Samurai structure deck. Also a very good structure deck. This came out right around the same time as the Dragons Collide structure deck, the Chaos Dragon structure deck. Not quite as much of the support was released at this time, so the deck would just take a little while longer to be really really competitively viable. But it is still a very very good value for what you were paying. This is the Atlantean structure deck. In terms of just buying 3 of these, this deck wasn't that good. But because Mermals came out during this time, this deck was very, very good. And I'll put it actually at the top of B tier too. This deck, like in terms of just buying 3 of them, it wasn't that good because you had to buy a bunch of other product in order to fill it up with like Mermals. But by itself, it was just an okay deck. It created a new Umi field spell, which instead of like the old Umi field spell reduced your levels, the new Umi field spell increased your levels, and on top of that, it gave you the Atlantean Prince, stuff like that. Cards that to this day are still very very usable. This deck in general had a huge meta impact. It's just like I said, you just needed to buy the Mermals in terms of doing it. So the only points it really loses is in that department. But it was a very like fun, very creative, very meta impactful deck. It's just that you had to buy a very expensive deck core in order to make this deck viable. Fire Kings, as much as it pains me to say this is at the top of C tier. Very different, very creative. This is the thing about this deck I like a lot. It was very creative because it focused on it's one of the first decks that focused on destroying your own cards. Actually, you know what? I'll put this in B tier. It focused on destroying your own cards, and that's why I kind of liked this deck a lot. Then it had stuff like Barbo. It had Searching. The boss monster was very good because it came back every standby phase and blew up the board, which I liked quite a bit. This is a very very fun deck, very creative deck. In terms of actual value too, it was actually a pretty good deck. Just because for 3 structure decks, you could actually play a pretty viable deck. The spells in the deck were pretty good. The only thing that this deck was missing was cards that would come out years later, like the field spell, for example. Yaksha came out actually during the time, right around the time this deck came out. The field spell is really what the deck was missing. It should have been there on release. I think if the field spell was packed in with the deck, this deck would be significantly higher on the list, but the field spell would come out much later, and the field spell really did speed up the deck, but by the time the field spell came out, the deck wasn't quite as good as it could have been on release, and that was kind of the issue there. Next is the Blue Eye Structure Deck. This is the one that came out with Maiden. It changed a lot about the deck. It actually made the deck I'll put this right here. It actually made the deck like somewhat viable. Like the deck wasn't like destroying tournaments, but it was definitely significantly a lot better. It had stuff like, if I remember correctly, Silver's Cry, Maiden. Maiden at the time was very good. If it was targeted for an attack or a card effect, you can switch it to defense mode and then special summon a Blue Eyes from your deck, which was very good. And if it was targeted for an attack, you could do all that. On top of that, it came out with Azure Eyes, which also was a very, very good, like, I don't want to say a boss monster, but it came out with a new synchro monster, a new mechanic for Blue Eyes to use, which was very important just because it gave you recursion, stuff like that. Let you summon monsters from the graveyard. It gave you protection. So it took Blue Eyes, basically an old legacy deck that wasn't even a real deck. Like the only thing Blue Eyes had at the time of this deck's release was like Kaiba Man, Burst Stream of Destruction, and like Blue Eyes itself. And then this deck came out and actually like took it to a whole archetype of itself, which is pretty cool. Which is, yeah, like I said, this is a very, very good deck for that. Next, we've got the Cyber Dragon Structure Deck. This is, I'd say this is a fair place to put it. Cyber Dragon Structure Deck basically gave us Nova. Nova basically increased the ceiling of the deck. It allowed you to special summon significantly more monsters. So for that reason, I think the deck is very good. It was still a bit slow, and the deck wouldn't really be like amazing until Infinity came out, but it definitely increased the ceiling on what Cyber Dragons can do. And this is like where they started, where it kind of shifted, where they started including legacy decks into structure decks, because as you can see here, there wasn't a lot of legacy decks other than like the Red Eyes and the Dark Magician one. There wasn't actually that many legacy decks. This is where they would start like picking up older decks and giving them new support. Next, we've got Lightsworn. This is another deck that had a lot of competitive impact. I'd say, yeah, this is a fair place to put it. A lot of competitive impact from this deck, simply because, again, you could buy 3 of them and get a pretty solid value. This deck is really, really good. It gives you Michael, which is the Lightsworn Synchro Monster. He was really good. Pay 1,000, banish any card. Soft once per turn. On top of that, it came out with, if I remember correctly, Raiden, which is by far the best Lightsworn monster, even to this day, because he lets you mill during the middle of your main phase. He's a tuner. He has a lot of very, very positive things going for him, and then of course he mills again during the end phase. This deck was very, very good to pick up during this time, and of course, yeah, like it was the release of Raiden, and Raiden is like the GOAT. Alright, next we've got the Yugioh Structure Deck. This structure deck is just funny. I swear to you, you can walk into any Walmart in the country and still find 15 of these decks lying on the shelves. This deck is literally everywhere. This deck is like, it has a few good cards, but like it wasn't like too good at the time. It basically worked around the gadgets. You had Yugioh X, which is a pretty good card. It lets you search on summon. Where would I place this? This is somewhere around C tier. I don't think this is a particularly creative deck. Yeah, it's just an okay deck. Like I said, it's very common to find to this day. It was honestly, from what I could tell, a very, very poorly sold deck. Like this deck used to come in like every mystery box, every pack-in, every Walmart had it. It still has it. Like they will do anything to get rid of this deck, and it still seems to be everywhere. Yeah, this deck was just not the best. This is actually an A tier deck. I'd say this would be a fair place to put it. Yeah, in terms of creativity, it's not like stupid creative, but it took a legacy deck and actually made it very competitive. You have Elemental Hero Shadow Mist, which is a very good card. Searches on summon, on special summon, and then on top of that, if it's sent from field to graveyard, you get an additional search. So it's like very, very good. It revolves all around the mask change cards and the new like masked heroes, which were all very, very good. Darklaw is an insane boss monster. All of your opponent's cards get banished, and then if they search or draw, you get to banish your card from their hand. Or basically, get rid of a card, but it always gets banished, and anything that goes to the graveyard gets banished. But basically, this had a very good impact, like, in terms of heroes. And it raised the ceiling of heroes for years. Like, heroes would become a much better deck for a very long time. It got tons of competitive, like, what is it called? Representation in all types of things. But this whole A tier, all of the decks on this A tier have had either they're very creative or they've had competitive representation, and this is no different. Synchron Extreme. This deck came out years after, like, this is after XYZs are out. Synchros aren't really, like, huge into the game, but I actually like this deck a lot. I'll put it right there. It's kind of like the top end of B tier. This deck had a lot of good utility cards. It wasn't, like, the most competitively insane deck, but it had a lot of just really, really good utility cards available to you. Like, the value of the deck was very good. You had stuff like Jet Synchron, stuff like that. Very, very good value for what you were kind of paying for the deck. And it did attempt to bring back Synchros, but in reality, I don't think... this is too, like, deep into the meta to make a serious, like, impact to do all of that. Alright, next is the Master Pendulum Deck. This is another pretty good one. This is like, this deck was more, in a lot of ways, like I don't want to say, it wasn't like an introduction into Pendulums, because that was the Pendulum starter deck. But this was like, more of like all of the best Pendulum monsters that were out. It was a very, like, good pickup during the time. Very good value. It was right before the Pepe combo and all of that nonsense. But Pepe never really got to be anything, just because the best cards got hit on the ban list. But this is a fair place to put this would be, I'd say, yeah, this is a fairly good deck to pick up. I'd say it's somewhere around here. This is like I said, a lot of the Dragon Pulse Magician, a lot of the various Magician cards, Performance Pal cards were in there. It was definitely a very solid pickup during this time. Yeah, pretty good deck. Emperor Structure Deck. Alright, this is our first S tier. This deck hits all three things. It's creative. Alright, so we'll explain it all. Creativity-wise, this deck is very creative. It encourages you to not play an extra deck, which is absolutely insane, because an extra deck is 15 more cards that Konami can sell to you, and they decided, you know what, we don't even want to sell you those cards. We'll make a deck that you don't even have to use that extra deck. But basically, yeah, it's a deck where it throws the extra deck completely out the window. It throws special summoning completely out the window. Like, your whole deck is built around tribute summoning. Like, you do special summon, but you only special summon so you could tribute those monsters. But it throws special summoning out the window, and this is after years of just basically one normal summon and the 50 special summons. So it's very cool that it does that. All of the cards are just these old monarch cards that nobody had used in years, and now you bring them back and you include a bunch of floodgates, draw cards, consistency cards, and this deck had an immediate meta impact. Not only did it have an immediate meta impact, this deck actually, in terms of value, is the best structure deck that has ever been released, because you could literally buy 3 of these, and you wouldn't even have to buy much of anything else. You literally could buy 3 of these, and you had a competitively viable deck. Which was kind of insane. All you needed was maybe just a few. It was a rare that came out in one of the sets, but other than that other rare card, and I don't mean rare as in like very difficult to find. I mean rare as in the rarity rare, as in the cards with the silver letters. As long as you had 3 of this deck and that rare, you basically had a very competitively viable deck. You literally, and when I say competitively viable, I don't mean like you can go to locals and get 6th place. I mean, like, you could literally go to a regional with 3 structure decks and get top 8. Like, that's how good the structure deck was. It was absolutely insane. It changed everything in terms of structure decks. It was almost too good, and the deck got hit very, very quickly, because Konami knew, like, listen, we're not going to be able to continue this forever. Like, Like people are buying literally 3 structure decks and going to regionals. Like this, yeah, this deck was absolutely insane. Very good deck. Easily one of the best decks ever printed. This is the Felgrand deck part 2. This is the Felgrand deck part 1 is right here. This deck was significantly better than the first one. The boss monster was actually good. It came out with Arcbrave Dragon, which is very good. I'll put it right here. Yeah, Arcbrave Dragon. Actually, I think I rated this deck a little too high, to be honest with you. This is just a bunch of utility cards. This is probably B tier, and I actually think I rated this unfairly. This deck was very, very much creative, and this is more or less utility cards. But yeah, the Felgrand deck, I'd say it was very good. It actually became better as time went on, because as they released more Blue Eyes cards, this deck got better. As they released other stuff, this deck got better. This deck as itself, actually I'll put this next to the Synchro Extreme deck. It was more of a deck in terms of it was good for its utility. Like a lot of the cards that were in it were good, but like the deck itself, like buying 3 of the deck wasn't like that great of a situation, but the cards inside the deck were actually pretty darn good. Like Return of the Dragon Lords was very, very good because it brought back level 7 or late dragons and gave them protection. So that was one of the cards that would make Blue Eyes a meta deck. Like, yeah, this deck itself wasn't that great, but it would actually have an impact on other decks like Blue Eyes. On top of that, Arcbrave Dragon would have a gigantic meta impact over the years. But definitely a very cool deck there. This is the Yugi structure deck. I like this from a creativity standpoint because it actually did not focus on Dark Magician. It focused on the Magnet Warriors, but from a playability standpoint, it was actually not that great. I'd say it's probably around C tier. Yeah, the Magnet Warriors weren't all that great. They kind of flopped. They were just, like, okay. They were really inconsistent, and like I said, they were just decent. But I do like the fact that they actually did not focus on Dark Magician, and they decided to focus more so on, like I said, the Magnet Warriors, which did not have any support at that time. Next, we've got our second S tier. This is actually the Kaiba structure deck. It has nothing to do with Blue Eyes, even though Blue Eyes is on the cover. This is actually the ABC structure deck. ABC as a deck like took off instantly. It was an extremely good deck. It was a very good deck. You could buy 3 of these structure decks and basically have a complete meta deck. And all you'd have to do is just mix in a few, just tech in a couple of like tech in just a few various like good trap cards, just staples. So you just have a bunch of staples, a couple of XYZ monsters that are like rank 4s, and you basically had a complete meta deck. Like this deck was very good on release. ABC Buster Dragon to this day is one of like the best fusion monsters ever released. It was a very good boss monster. Union Hanger fixed the entire like Union issue, and Unions just up until this deck pretty much sucked. But Union Hanger actually fixed that issue because it made it easier to equip Unions from your deck. It searched Union monsters. Like that field spell changed everything, and it finally fixed Unions. And Unions was also always a pretty cool. It was always a pretty cool typing. I always liked Unions better than like spell counters, and they came out in the same set. Magician's Force, spell counters, and Unions. I always liked Unions better. And yeah, just from a creativity standpoint, from a value standpoint, from a competitive impact standpoint, like this deck it fits all 3 of those. It fits all those 3 of those check marks. Definitely a very good deck. This is a DDD deck. This deck is a little bit I'd say this is at the top of B tier. Unfortunately, this deck came out at like the worst possible time for itself. It never really had a serious meta impact. Like it did have meta play, but the issue with this deck is it came out right around the time where Zodiacs were just absolutely disgusting and like so difficult to play against. So it never really got to shine because Zodiacs was essentially tier 0, and then they went to tier 1, and then stuff like Masterpiece and Dracos came out, and then right after that Link Master Rule 4 came out, and this deck was just dead. It just came out at the worst possible time. Like if it had come out a year earlier, I could probably see this deck winning Worlds. Like it's not out of the realm of possibility, but unfortunately it just came out during a very, very bad time, and for that reason it ended up making the deck not all that great for that reason. But I still think it's a very good deck in terms of the value. Even to this day, it's actually a pretty decent deck to pick up because now the Master Rule has changed. The deck has its own Link monster. Like there have been positive things that have happened. Next, we've got the Dinosaur Structure Deck. This is the more recent Dinosaur Structure Deck, easy S tier. You could pick up 3 of these and have a competitively viable deck. This deck is very, very good. The only thing you'd have to put in there is some of the new dinosaurs that have come out since this deck has come out, which wouldn't even be that many monsters. Yeah, you'd need like Giant Rex and Coatlas if you wanted to play that build. If you wanted to play the build with the what is it called, the Super Evolution Pill, the Ultra Evolution Pill, you could include those. It really depended on your build. At the time of release, all you needed to was pick up just a few super rare and ultra rare True Draco monsters, not True Draco, True King monsters, and you basically had a competitively viable deck. It's a very, very good deck. Like 3 of these structure decks could even make a serious impact. This deck actually won nationals in the United States of America, which was very, very good. And it beat out Zodiacs and it beat out True Dracos, which were both just like tier 1 decks, very good decks. But yeah, this deck is very good, was very good then, and to this day, this deck is actually very, very good. It like in terms of the value you get out of this deck, it's absolutely insane. To this day, like I said, this is still a very good deck. This is still right now, as we're recording this video, this is right now a tier 1 or tier 2 deck, and this came out in what, 2016, 17. It's been 3-4 years, and this deck is still a tier 1 or tier 2 deck. Very good deck. Next, we've got the Ancient Gear Structure Deck, the second one. I put this somewhere in C tier. Like, creativity-wise, this deck is pretty good, but it had, like, no impact, meta impact whatsoever. This deck got released at the same time as the Dinosaur Structure Deck. It had almost no meta impact, like, nobody played it. Ancient Gears are, they really, like, they walk the line between being broken and being unusable, unfortunately. And the problem is you can't make them too broken because then they'll be absolutely insane. But at the same time, it's like they're very underwhelming. This deck changed the way Ancient Gears were played, simply because it now relies on destroying your own cards in order to do stuff. So this deck focuses more so around popping its own cards now, in order to special summon larger Ancient Gear monsters. Unfortunately, the deck just wasn't as competitively viable as it needed to be. Additionally, like, the fusion monster is now like the main focus of the deck. There's like a very large fusion monster, unaffected by spells, unaffected by traps, but unfortunately it is affected by monsters. So, you know, you can just, it literally loses to like a Zodiac Trident, unfortunately. But other than that, this deck is actually, like, pretty decent. But like I said, I don't think it's enough to take it over the top, especially in, like, the modern era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Next, we've got this deck. This is another deck that just was, like, it didn't have, like, a huge meta impact. It really just had a bunch of utility monsters. It's kind of like the Synchro deck right here. But even less in terms of the meta impact. Basically, it just really had a few Cyberse monsters. It's more like an introductory deck. I'd say this is, like, it's pretty fair to put it, like, right here. Like, the only good monster it really had was, like, Trigate Wizard. Other than that, it just basically was, like I said, it was just more of, like, an introduction sort of a situation where it's like, oh, here are Link monsters. Here, go, you know, try these out. It wasn't really about, like, anything else. It wasn't really, like, a viable deck in any way on its own. Cyberse definitely was just not yet viable. It is more viable now, but even then, it's just not that particularly good. A Wave of Light Structure Deck. This deck had, during the time of release, no meta impact whatsoever. Actually, yeah, during the time of release, this deck had no meta impact. It had multiple cards on the ban list, like Judgment was banned, Warning was at 1. Like, this, like, it was very difficult to play. Like, this deck is significantly better now because Judgment's at 3, Warning's at 3, so you can play it now. But during the time of release, this deck had, like, no meta impact whatsoever. The other issue with this deck is the best way to play it is actually not to use any of the cards within the actual structure deck, because unfortunately Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the cards in the structure deck, like the Counter Fairy deck is a good deck, but the cards in the structure deck aren't even that good because you play a bunch of like big bricks. So the best way to play is just to play really good counter traps and then just play like Bountiful Artemis and the Barrier Statue and stuff like that. But outside of that, this deck is, like I said, the actual making it into a structure deck didn't make the deck better. Taking the thing that made the Counter Fairy deck better was releasing cards off the ban list that it needed to make the deck better. Next deck, I have a soft spot for this next deck. I like it a lot. In terms of creativity, this is by far one of the most creative decks on the entire list, the Lair of Darkness deck. By far one of the most creative decks. Simply because it has a field spell where it tributes your opponent's monster. And then on top of that, every monster and every effect that you have that tributes a card lets you tribute your opponent's cards for cost. So you can get over some of the most unbelievable monsters ever. Like you can get over stuff like Cyber Dragon Infinity. You can get over like Dragoon to this day just by like activating. You can normal summon Lilith, activate Lilith, tribute Dragoon, and Dragoon can't do anything because it tributes for cost. Like to this day, this deck is very cool. Like in terms of creativity, one of the most creative decks. It took crush card, like not crush cards. It took virus cards and turned them essentially into an entire archetype of their own. Yeah, in terms of this deck like maxes out that creativity stat, but unfortunately where a falls flat is in terms of meta impact. In terms of value, it's actually a pretty good deck. Like you can pick up 3 of these. Like if you had like a structure deck tournament, this deck would actually probably be near the top because it's a very complete deck in terms of what you're buying. You get a fairly you get your value's worth is what I'm saying. But yeah, it's value-wise, this deck is actually pretty good, and in terms of creativity, this deck is pretty good. This, in terms of meta impact, that's where this deck really is. That's kind of the area where this deck is just not good enough to get into A or S tier, despite the fact that I like the deck quite a bit. All right, next is the Power Code Link structure deck. This structure deck is actually better than the other Link structure deck, a lot better. Like, I'll put this up here. It actually no, it's right here. So in terms of like buying three of them and building a deck, it's actually not that great. But this deck actually had a lot of like new release like good cards. It comes with Sea Archiver, which had a pretty large meta impact. Lady Debug, which would later make a really big meta impact. What else? Power Code Talker, which also doubles attack, and then attacks for a ton of damage. Like it has some really good cards. Oh, Flame Buffaleros in this deck. This deck is very good in that regard. Like it comes with a lot of very good. It comes with a lot of very good cards that would later on impact all of the Cybers decks possible. Like it increases the ceiling of all Cybers decks going forward. The only thing with this deck is it's just not like what's it called? Like complete within itself. You can't buy 3 of these and really do much with it. But you can combo it with like other Cybers decks and make those decks significantly better. So for that reason, it is in the middle of B tier. Zombie World. This is another deck that I like a lot. I'll put this at the top of B tier. Actually, no, this has a this is at the bottom of A tier. This had a much larger impact on the meta than all these other decks here. On top of that, it's a very creative deck. Like I've said before, Zombie World as a concept is a very creative deck. Changing all of the types on the field to zombie and both graveyards to zombie has a lot of just implications that you don't even think about, because a lot of cards will say like, oh, it needs like a Cybers monster in order to summon, which it's basically like a continuous floodgate, the Zombie World field spell. So that's just a field spell. Then you get a new card called Doom King Balderok, which is absolutely insane. It has a non-targeting either negate or a non-targeting banish whenever a zombie activates an effect, and of course you turn all cards on the field, all monsters on the field into zombies, all monsters in the graveyard into zombies. So basically whenever your opponent activates pretty much anything, it's always going to be a zombie, and you're always going to be able to either negate that monster effect or banish, which is really good, and you can use both those effects in one turn. Then you had the Necro Banshee, which is another really good card because it makes it very easy to get out your Zombie World field spell. Extremely easy. So yeah, that made it very, very good. And then the last card that came with the deck was a card called Tsuchinoko. It was like a zombie monster that you synchro summon out of the hand. That card wasn't that good, but Glow Up Bloom was actually pretty good too. That card, if it's sent to the graveyard from anywhere, you have Zombie World on the field, you can special summon a level 5 or higher zombie, and then you're locked into zombies. But that's not a huge deal in a zombie deck. So that card was also very, very good. It came with a lot of very, very good cards, and it wouldn't have like a huge meta impact, but this is the kind of deck where you can, to this day, go to a tournament and top with this deck. Like it's a good enough deck where if you know what you're doing and if you're very, very skilled with the deck, you can definitely top. Like I can easily top just about any locals with this deck at any time. Like, it's that good of a deck. And even regionals, you can top most regionals with this deck. Very, very good deck. Very much worth the 3 structure decks that it would cost $30. Very good value and very creative too. Next, we've got the Soulburner structure deck. This is right above the... It's going to be right above the Seto Kaiba structure deck. This is actually a very good deck too. During the time of this deck's release, it was like sold out everywhere. It was a very good deck. All you basically needed was 3 copies of the structure deck, and then all you had to buy was a copy of Salamangreat. It was Sunlight Wolf, which was a rare, and the Fusion of Fire, which was another rare. Like, this deck was very cheap. You basically picked up a couple of staples and you had a complete Salamangreat deck. It was a very good value. On top of that, this actually came with a reprint of Ash, which during the time was like $10, and the whole structure deck was $10. So you were basically getting you're getting easily like a $20 value out of a $10 structure deck. So in terms of value, it's very good. In terms of creativity, it took a sort of haphazardly put together Cyberse archetype and actually took it over the edge and made it a tier 1 deck. Very good. Very, very, very good structure deck. You could buy 3 of these and be fairly competitive. All you would need to do is, like I said, just put in the Sunlight Wolves. But definitely a very, very good deck on release. Enderman Deck. This is an A tier deck. It did have a meta impact. It's just you have to pick up a lot of other cards in order to make it good. So I'll put it like right here. It was very competitively viable, and what I like is that it did take the whole spell counter mechanic and actually make it good. This is the first time where they successfully made spell counters good. So they made Union monsters good with the Kaiba deck, and then they made with this deck the spell counters very, very good. And then of course the only issue with this deck is that you have to pick up a lot of other cards, like the mythical beast cards. You have to pick up the Pendulum monster cards. You have to pick up at the time you had to pick up Metal Foes Electromite, which was actually fairly expensive. And the problem with this deck was you couldn't just buy 3 of them and like make it very good. But if you actually went through all the steps of buying all the other Pendulum cards, when you finished the deck, it was actually a very, very good deck. Next, we've got the Rocket structure deck, Rocket Revolt. This one's a little hard to place because, like I said, this is not like... You couldn't just buy 3 of these and build a good deck, but you would actually need to pick up a lot of other dragon cards, the guard dragons. You have to pick up like Abyss, stuff like that, and then the deck would actually become a very good deck. And to this day, this deck is actually still very good. I think these 3 decks came out in 2018. It's been like 2 years, and they're still very, very good. It's like I said, this is kind of hard to place. I'd put it right next to... Actually, yeah, I'll put it right next to the spell counter deck. It's like I said, it's a very good deck. The rocket monsters are all very good. Apsarouter is very good. Silver Rocket's very good. Rocket Tracer's obviously very good because it's essentially you turn any of your dead cards into another rocket monster, and you basically get a free Borload Savage Dragon. The only thing that this deck has over the spell counter deck is that you actually have to buy less cards to make the deck competitively viable, and a lot of the cards that you have to buy are very, very cheap, like like the guard dragons, which at this point are like 50 cents. Even when they were first released, they were all super rares, so they were like maximum like $1. And then even with Argo Pain, the best card you could summon was the Dragon Abyss, which is the red Dragon Abyss, which you could easily just substitute that out for like a Crystal Wing, and it would be just very, very good. Taking this deck from like a 3 structure decks to a somewhat competitively viable deck was actually fairly easy. And like I said, to this day, the Dragon Link deck is very good, and a lot of cards have released over time and made this deck better and better every single time. But definitely a very good deck. Should all structure deck. The rest of these are kind of interesting because other than this Machina structure deck, the rest of these were actually all voted on by the fan base. So this is like the final era of structure decks here that I'm going to be showing. You've had different waves of structure decks. You had the structure decks with one boss monster and mostly reprints. Then you had the structure decks with, where they actually started releasing new cards. And then you had the structure decks where it was all about the boss monsters. And now these are the structure decks that are basically voted on, with the exception of this one right here. And it's an interesting era, I gotta say. The Shadal one was actually really good. Still has a very good meta impact, mostly because of Shadal Schism. But this one is actually pretty good. I remember on release it was topping actually fairly consistently, and you didn't have to add all that much. You mostly just add like trip clowns and stuff like that. But actually, Shadal structure deck should probably be somewhere up here. It was a pretty good structure deck on release. 3 of these, and you had, like I said, a pretty competitive deck. Creativity wise, it's like a very like graveyard heavy deck. So for those reasons, it's actually fairly good. Yeah, it's a very good deck. Very solid pickup. Machina deck. This deck unfortunately came out during a bad time. It came out in the middle of a pandemic. There wasn't a lot of advertising for this deck, and it came out like right after Orcus got hit. This deck has had almost no meta impact whatsoever. I've seen a couple people play around with like the they've played around with like the Orcus Machina deck, but again, like it tops here and there, but very sparsely. And it's kind of sad because no one really gave this deck a chance, and it seems like every single set gets a new Machina card, and despite that, like it's almost like nobody cares. Like this nobody plays the deck, no one gives it a try. It just it was released at just a very bad time. It has actually a pretty decent amount of cards for ABCs. It was more of like a machine support deck more than it was its own like archetype. So for those reasons, and in terms of like playing 3 copies, like just like 3 of these decks, I think that's just out the window. Like I haven't seen a single person ever even try to do that. So unfortunately, for all of those reasons, this deck is right around the Yugioh deck right here. Unfortunately, just like I said, it was just released at a very bad time. There weren't really any events going on. It actually was released during the same month that basically the entire world went into lockdown. So this deck just had some really bad luck, unfortunately. And then right after, like right within the same like time, like week, maybe 1 to 2 week period that this deck came out, Master Rule 5 came out. In addition to Master Rule 5, Needle Fiber came out, and that whole meta just exploded, and no one ever looked back on this deck ever again. It was just like it's kind of like a dead deck, unfortunately. Next we've got and like I said, to this day you could probably walk into Walmart and still find this deck. You can walk into most card shops, Walmarts, Targets, and this deck is still sitting on the shelves untouched, like nobody even looking at it. Next we've got the Sacred Beast structure deck. This deck is actually really cool. I honestly, from a creativity standpoint, I think this deck was like really creative, because they had to take 3 monsters that have absolutely nothing to do with each other and kind of like combine them all in one deck. But in terms of compatibility, this deck just doesn't have that much of a competitive impact. I'd say a fair place to put it would be like right here. Like I said, competitively, just not that great of a deck. But in terms of creativity, I think it's pretty up there. And in terms of value, like 3 structure decks of this deck is actually a pretty good value. I would say 3 structure decks of this deck can pretty much beat almost everything B tier and below. Like it's a very it's very good for the structure deck value. The only thing that you really need to add to this deck is All Mirage and optionally Magician Souls. But All Mirage is definitely the card that you need to add to this deck to have the combos going. But it's definitely a very good deck, and like I said, this is one of those decks that probably will get more support as time progresses. I don't like this next deck at all. At all. I'm very frustrated with this. This for me is like an F tier deck. I don't like it at all. And this is a fan favorite, and I'm probably gonna get some sort of anger out of this. I don't like this deck. I actually will even put it lower. This sits like, this is where Geminis are for me. I don't like this deck. And I don't like Geminis, just because the actual monsters of this deck are very bad. So they basically have to print a bunch of semi-broken spell and trap cards in order to make the deck viable in any way whatsoever. It's basically a bunch of monsters that have irrelevant monster effects. Like their monster effects are absolutely terrible. They're basically normal monsters with monster effects that are 1850 attack, and then you basically just sit on a bunch of floodgates, like Secret Village of the Spellcasters, and various other negate cards like Magician's left hand, Magician's right hand, the field spell itself that negates the first monster effect. And you basically sit on a bunch of protection spell and trap cards, negates, floodgates, stuff like that. I really don't like the deck. From a concept standpoint, it's had absolutely no meta impact whatsoever. I don't think that the deck is creative in any way. It had one good reprint. This is the deck that I'm very disappointed that did well in voting, because I thought it was just such a waste of a spot. There are so many decks out there that are real decks that haven't gotten any support for years. Stuff like I don't know, Volcanics, Hazy Flames, Insectors, Phantasm Spirals, decks out there that could really use a structure deck, and unfortunately they missed it because of this fan favorite artwork deck that unfortunately ate up the spot. The only reason this deck even won was because people like the artworks. It's really frustrating, and this deck just is everything wrong with the whole fan base voting for decks. The Shaddoll structure deck was everything right with the fan base voting for decks, and this is everything wrong with the fan base voting for decks, because a deck that really did not need a structure deck, that was just competitively unviable, and after the deck still competitively unviable, and is not a fun deck to play in any way, got a structure deck, got a waste of a structure deck, and now it basically sits to this day on Walmart shelves. Nobody's even looking to buy it. There are very few builds of this deck on YouTube, and I haven't seen a single person talk with this deck ever. So based on that rant, you could see I'm very unhappy on that. Next is this Ice Dragon structure deck. This is a fairly recent deck. Again, not very competitively viable, I gotta tell you. This was more of people voted for it because, in theory, it was a cool concept, because the ice barriers are kind of a mixed bag. Unfortunately, the problem with the ice barriers is they're kind of all over the place. They have half their monsters are floodgate monsters, half of them are weird tuners. The synchros are all amazing, but the regular main deck monsters are pretty terrible. So they actually had to give them some new main deck monsters that were a little bit better. Some of the cards that came out are not bad. The new Trishula monster is actually pretty good. The new trap card is actually pretty good. It's more of just general synchro support than it is its own viable archetype. But I've seen it played a few times, and it's actually a pretty decent deck. It's definitely better than this Familiar Possessed structure deck, which I absolutely hate, the Spirit Charmer structure deck. So as of right now, this could change as new cards come out, but I'd say this is somewhere around B tier. I'd say this is fairly placed at the bottom of B tier until I see otherwise. Like I said, this is just not that competitive a structure deck, but it is a fairly decent structure deck, in terms of all of the reprints that you're getting, in terms of the fact that it's not exactly easy to connect the entire Ice Barrier structure deck. There's a lot going on in there. But that is basically it. This is the entire tier list. Very proud with this tier list. Like I said, actually, what I'm more happy about is that structure decks have actually gotten better over the course of time. As you can see, just based on this tier list, most of the F tiers are the older ones. F and D tiers are most of the older structure decks, and most of the better structure decks are most of the newer structure decks. Like all of the S tiers have come out in the last 5 years, and stuff that came out like 15 years ago was just a lot worse. They've really fixed structure decks, and it's probably one of the best product that Yu-Gi-Oh has to offer. So thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and have a great day. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy this type of content, check out the other videos on the channel, and please subscribe. It helps the channel a lot. Again, thank you so much. Have a terrific day.